When I was putting this course together, I thought automatically of Gene Chalmers, Zohara Simmons, and Dan Harbeling, people that we've known over the years who did remarkable things long before we ever came to Gainesville. And to introduce uh, Gene properly, I'm going to hand this over to Phyllis Sheridan, who's been helping her write her memoirs. So she is an expert on Gene Chalmers.
Oh, I wouldn't say that at all. Thank you, Richard. Uh, I've known Jean since I first moved to Alachua County in 1990, and she took me under her wing then, and I'm paying it back now. Jean was born on the windswept prairies of Alberta and grew up in Victoria, British Columbia. She, having an adventurous spirit, traveled widely in post-World War II Europe, seeking new experiences. By the time she was in her late 20s in 1958, she was in Manhattan working as a fashion model. That's where she met the man she married, David Chalmers, a professor of American history at the University of Florida. The civil rights movement was just beginning when David brought her to Gainesville. And their lifelong careers as civil rights activists in North Florida began with initially joining the Gainesville Council on Human Relations, affiliated with the Atlanta-based Southern Regional Council. Managing to evade threatened actions by the Ku Klux Klan over several years, by 1997, Jean had served on the Gainesville City Commission for 6 years and was the president of the Southern Regional Council. On that council, she served with such distinguished Americans as Georgia Senator Julian Bond, and David Chalmers became a national expert on the KKK. This afternoon, we'll learn about her 40 years of civil rights and political advocacy and the roles of many people, including UF faculty, in making Gainesville and North Central Florida a better place for all. Jean.
Oh, I see a lot of friends out there. Hello. Uh, you know know a lot about me. I'd like to know a little bit about you all. How many here have either written their memoir or are busy writing it? Only one? Oh, two. Okay. Oh, and a half? 2.5. That's great. So here's my chapter. I think this is what, chapter 15 of my memoir. I'm 91 years old, so I'm starting to write a little bit faster, and I hope I make it. Or maybe writing your memoir keeps you alive because you can't die until you finish. So here is my chapter on the civil rights movement. I start with a little poem before every chapter. So I recommend that to you, memoir. You're all going to be writing your memoir, right? Okay. So I start this one with Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. The civil rights movement was a time when people of goodwill had to decide what they could do to change the way descendants of former slaves were treated. It was a time when raw racism had to be defeated. To begin, we had to decide which adjectives should be used to describe formerly enslaved people. The N word, written as N asterisk, 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 was not acceptable. So Negro became somewhat acceptable, but still did not sit well with many of us. When Black and African American competed for the preferred terms, many of my older friends did not like the term Black, saying, their skin is certainly not black. Clearly, African American won out, but the young people of today seem to be perfectly comfortable with Black. In this writing, I try to select the acceptable word at that time, even though it makes me feel a little uncomfortable sometimes in 2024. I became a civil rights worker on a rainy day in 1959 while walking in front of Baird's Hardware downtown along 2nd Avenue. There were a lot of things out on the sidewalk being displayed, and there I was going along this sidewalk, leaving only a narrow path for other people. It was raining pretty hard, so I had my umbrella to protect my pretty New York dress. I can clearly remember an elderly Negro couple walking along that sidewalk and going into the gutter to let me pass. I went home, said to David, I cannot live in this world of Jim Crow laws. To which David replied, well, we can move up north or we can stay and fight. The choice was clear. The next Sunday, we went to the Fifth Avenue Ghetto section to downtown to attend the meeting at the Negro Library. That's the one with all the chalk marks on it and covers missing, pages torn out that were put in the Negro Library. The Gainesville Council on Human Relations that was established by the Southern Regional Council up in Atlanta was meeting every month there. Their executive director had been going from town to town throughout the South with a sleeping bag and his worldly goods in the trunk of his car, establishing these little councils of troublemakers. It's interesting to know that in 1997, I became the president of the Southern Regional Council in Atlanta, where I served with such distinguished Americans as Georgia Senator Julian Bond, Lottie Shackelford. She'd been mayor of Little Rock. Remember, she was the little girl that the press took pictures of when she was integrating the school. Lottie was a great person. Jim Clyburn. Jim is now our congressman. And I remember I'd come up with a bright idea and Jim would say, now, Gene. So I just hope he's up there saying, now, Senator. I recall asking the first Muslim on our board who had a skull cap why he wore that skull cap. The explanation he gave me was exactly the same as the one I got from my Jewish friends. How sad that the children of Abraham can't get along, eh? Our local council in Gainesville met on the third Sunday of every month to formulate action plans to try to improve the day-to-day life of Negroes. We learned that in some segregated neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city, there was no running water or sewers. Pumps had been installed at the crossroads, and families had to tote water home by the pail. Many houses had outdoor toilets, and wastewater from washing machines was drained into a barrel in the ground with holes in the side to dispense the water throughout the garden. We regularly went to city commission meetings to protest these conditions. At one memorable meeting, Tina Cohen, many of you may remember her, presented slides from the League of Women Voters of houses in segregated neighborhoods in terrible conditions. They were all rental houses. The slides showed that they were owned by members of the city commission. There was a lot of squirming that day. Years later, we were criticized for being patronizing to poor folks when we should be encouraging them to organize and protest themselves. These were dangerous times, and we did not think it would be safe for Negroes to make such demands. The Ku Klux Klan was still meeting in the woods outside of town. When David and I were first married, we lived in a cottage on Swan Lake in the little town of Melrose. Often on a dark night, we could see the floodlights shining up on the sky somewhere in the neighboring woods. That signaled there was either a girly show or a Ku Klux Klan meeting gathering. Historian David hustled off to observe the spectacle and to take careful notes of the women's shoes. He thought he could determine their class by their shoes. One night, he met Manning Dower there. That was the chairman of political science department. Manning was recording license plates because he wanted to know in which county they lived. Oh, let's get another thing. David, hoping to get an inside scoop on the Ku Klux Klan, asked some of the members if he could join. So when he was interviewed at his house in a couple of days by some Klansmen, they observed his rather obvious Hittite nose and declared that Jews were not allowed in the Klan and immediately left. At the Negro Library, deep in the historic Fifth Avenue neighborhood, I met my lifelong friend, Rosa Williams. Rosa was born in a little town up in Brooker, just north of Gainesville, and she worked as a housekeeper for two university professors. Some of you might know Dell and Jane Starrett. They recognized how talented she was and how intelligent she was, and they brought her to our meetings. The group decided that we should have a covered dish dinner one Sunday and appointed Rosa and me as the planning committee. I had no idea what a covered dish dinner was and wondered what would happen if everyone brought meat or everyone brought a cake. Rosa said, "If you're doing the Lord's work, he will separate the food right." And so he did, and he continues to do so. Somehow the Ku Klux Klan learned of our meetings, and when the Gainesville Police Department found out that the Klan intended to raid one of them, we were invited to move upstairs in the conference room that it was above the old jail, which was where the police station was, until the scare calmed down. Of course, there was no place in public that Negro and white people could socialize, so we entertained in each other's homes. In our Negro friends' homes, we enjoyed watching entertainers from the Chitlin circuit perform on TV, and we learned how to drink scotch and milk. However, we never learned how to eat fish sandwiches. Negro people could gracefully pull the fish bone out through their lips, while we white folks, we'd take a bite of it, we couldn't figure out where the bone was. We'd have to spit out the fish and the bone in a napkin and get rid of it. That was sure a problem later when I was campaigning for election. About 20 years later, in the mid-1980s, when I was mayor of Gainesville, I was able to change the name of the Negro Library to the Rosa B. Williams Recreation Center. Power is great. Miss Rosa finally went to Santa Fe Community College and got a degree in social services. She had served on many boards, including Shands Hospital and the Airport Auxiliary. I remember the day Rosa was elected to the United Way board. All we good white women put on our best dresses and our little white sandals and went off to the United Way meeting so we could vote at the meeting. When the time came, when the call came to nominate from the floor, Rosa's name was registered. The votes were counted. We women outnumbered the men in attendance, and we won. Rosa became the first woman to serve on the United Way board. Up until then, United Way did not fund any Negro charities. Bell Nursery in the ghetto and the Boys Club on the east side of town applied every year, and they were rejected every year. That soon changed. Rosa still proudly lives in the little wooden house on a narrow lane. However, many of the more prosperous families have moved to new developments on the east side of town, and many of the vibrant small businesses on Fifth Avenue had to close down. Gentrification is still in full swing there, with lots of mummies and daddies buying those wonderful old homes for their children to live in. While we were having our polite meetings at the Negro Library, the Youth Council of the NAACP, under the leadership of Joel Buchanan and Charles Chestnut, formed the Student Group for Equal Rights, SQUIR, we call them, on campus at the university, and began to picket the College Inn, a popular restaurant across the street from campus. The only movie house in town where Negroes could attend was an old Quonset hut that the Silverman family had set up for them. Now, just 75 miles from Gainesville in the ancient city of St. Augustine, race relations were getting quite dangerous. The Mallorcans, who came from as indentured servants to that old city, they were from a Mediterranean island. In 1565 they came, and they felt economically threatened by the Negro. Thus, many of them remained deeply prejudiced and joined a racist organization called the Ancient City Hunting Club, organized by a bootlegger named Halstead Richard Hos Manusi, we called him, a dangerous guy. In the 1960s, Reverend Thomas Wright left his congregation in St. Augustine for fear of his life in that deeply prejudiced historic city and came to Gainesville as the pastor of the original Mount Carmel Church, just off Fifth Avenue. He soon became a leader in the movement, and it was from his church that all the marches and protests were organized in the city of Gainesville. Several years later, he moved his family into a white neighborhood in Forest Ridge. I am happy to say they were welcomed. In March of 1964, a call went out from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come fill the jails in St. Augustine to protest the hostile treatment of Negroes there. Mary Peabody, the mother of the governor of Massachusetts, answered the call. And so did my husband, David Chalmers, and his colleagues in UF biology, Brian McNabb. He and Brian sat down in Walgreens drugstore food counter with a young Negro man, and they were all arrested and jailed. David tells of the policeman who drove him to jail, saying, "I'm from New Hampshire, and we just had the same kind of problems with French Canadians in our part of the country." Evidently, the jail cells were packed because they had to take turns sleeping on the floor so they could breathe some fresh air under the door jambs. J.B. Stoner, the Klansman who'd bombed the church in Birmingham where those 3 little girls were killed, had free range of the jailhouse. As a result of children's polio, he walked with a limp. David could hear him thumping back and forth in the hallway and prayed that he did not know that the Ku Klux Klan scholar was in that cell. I found a babysitter for Henry, put $300 in my bra, picked up my Australian friend, Pat Heidenheimer. Does Pat still live here? No, Pat Heidenheimer. Yeah, she lived here for a while. I think she's gone to heaven, I'm sure. Anyhow, we headed to St. Augustine. I asked Pat to come along because with her Aussie accent, we could pretend we were tourists. If the Klansmen stopped us, well, they didn't stop us, but they were holding a rally on the side of the road. And in town, Klansmen's robes were on the back ledge in every sheriff's car. Scary times. In 1963, when a call went out for faculty wives to help fill the picket lines, prepare research papers, and write amicus curiae briefs, the women of this gentle gathering at the Negro Library shifted to the more aggressive Gainesville Women for Equal Rights, GWEAR. Now, you remember GWEAR. We gathered women from the Negro community, teachers, social workers, nurses, and activists, to a meeting at the Presbyterian Student Center to hear what daily life was like in the segregated world. We learned that Negro women were not allowed to try on clothes in the shop. They had to buy off the hanger, and they were not allowed to return goods. They learned that a special outing for a Negro family was to drive through the white neighborhoods to see how luxurious lives were for white people. But they had to be out of those neighborhoods before sunset. We learned that maids and gardeners usually earned 75 cents per hour with no Social Security, sick days, or vacation time off. That is equivalent to $7.57 per hour today. They had to use special toilets that were installed in white folks' garages. Faculty wives from up north knew nothing about these rules and Jim Crow laws. They were shocked. Some Greer members helped folks get organized in the neighborhood, horse country down in Ocala. It was there that member June Littler and others were arrested and put in jail until bail money could be raised. Many of the white old-timers were from scrabble poor North Carolina families. They'd come down by wagon through Georgia to find a better life in North Florida. They fought the Seminoles for land. They rustled non-branded cows for their livestock, planted crops in soil that seemed to be either full of gumbo clay or sand. They survived through hurricanes and the yellow fever plague. They were followed by a richer class of farmers who brought their slaves with them. Thus, you'll see the word plantation in many upper-class neighborhoods in Florida. One interesting thing about these slaves is that when emancipation came, they changed the spelling of their names just to let everyone know that they were free and no longer belonged to their previous slaveholding family. Thus, we have Chestnut's office supply on the corner of University and Main. But the now powerful and renowned family that descended from those slaves spell their names Chestnut. In the mid-1880s, vaudeville entertainment always included a mocking blackface man by the name of Jim Crow. Thus, the laws to control freed black slaves came to be known by that pejorative term. The white upper class certainly did not want former slaves to own any land and wanted them to remain as close to free labor as they could. The white lower class was extremely poor, and often their only comfort was the knowledge that former slaves were even poorer. Greer was concerned about the terrible disrespect and abusive language that sheriff's deputies exhibited around Negroes, and we suspected that one of the reasons was their very low pay that made them almost, but not quite, as poor as the Negro. We arranged a meeting with the sheriff to complain about the poverty of his undersheriffs and how it made them afraid that giving more rights to Negroes would only make their position worse. The sheriff, who came from a wealthy family, seemed to have no idea that his pay scale kept his employees in abject poverty. He raised their pay. Despite the long, hard hours of the only Negro physician and dentist in town, Dr. Cullen Banks and Dr. Edgar Cosby, health care was almost non-existent for Negroes. I will never forget when registered nurse Neil Butler, the first Negro to be elected to the city commission, went to the Department of Health and Welfare for a physical exam. He came out laughing because Dr. Murphy gave him a complete physical exam without ever touching him. Neil said, I guess he figured it would rub off. When we went to register children for kindergarten, not only did we have to raise money for shoes, but we had to help mothers fill out forms to register their child with vital statistics in the state of Florida. They were all born at home with a midwife. The U.S. College of Medicine arranged for young physicians doing their residency to examine these children and to provide a certificate of proof that they had been given a recent medical exam. For most of these young men, it was the first time they had ever touched a Negro skin. Armed with all the tools to get these kindergartners to school, we then went door to door to find the children and get them registered. We went deep into the Negro community and were welcomed graciously. Here we often learned that the light-skinned members of the family had been sent up north for better jobs with better pay, where better pay could be held by Negroes. I do remember the time in Archer stopping at a corner store to buy a Coke and being turned away with a shotgun. The word was out that we were not too safe in some of the outlying communities. In fact, we were not too safe in our own homes. David and I got enough nigger lover calls in the middle of the night that we were afraid to let Henry play alone in the backyard. We finally built a 6-foot Ocala block high fence around our backyard on our corner property in Palmview Estates. If you drive through there and you see all of those blocks, that's where we lived. In addition, someone tried to burn down the house of our white attorney member who was preparing an amicus curiae brief for one of our numerous law school suits. While civil rights worker Carol Thomas never missed an opportunity to scold elected and volunteer boards about the race issue. This so annoyed some members of the Gainesville police that they continually arrested her, once even killing her dog in an effort to scare her from being so vocal. It did not work, so they drummed up a false charge to haul her off to jail several times. Throughout the 1960s, Greer was deeply involved in school integration. We supported busing, but did not like the kind that only brought Negro students into predominantly white schools, but also those where white children should be bused into predominantly Negro schools. Many small private schools and, quote, religious schools popped up all over the county, and political pressure started for them to get some state funding. That pressure is still coming from the conservative Florida legislature. We met with 2 school board members, Dr. Bill Enneking, an orthopedic surgeon, and Dr. Ben Samuels, a highly respected dentist, originally from Mississippi. Both of these courageous white men were very supportive of our positions, but we all clearly knew that they had to get reelected. So we had to be careful how they could help us without risking losing them on the school board. We also worked closely with Gainesville High School principal Tiny Talbot. We knew that he really preferred segregation because he did everything to thwart the enrollment of Joel Buchanan and Charles Chestnut. However, he believed that equal treatment of the races. So when the Black Lincoln High School students when it was closed down and they were sent to Gainesville High for the semester, in the middle of the semester in 1969, Tiny Talbot brought his football team into his office and told them that Negro students were coming to their high school and that the white members of the team had the authority to stop any display or acts of racism they saw. It succeeded. The football team kept the peace, and it also got some really good football players. Of course, Greer thought that both high schools should remain open and both should be fully integrated. So we started fighting for the jobs of Negro teachers that should have been transferred to Gainesville High, but did not have the proper certificate. Greer's position was that those teachers should be sent free of charge to the University of Florida to attend classes and pass the exams that qualified them to receive the same teaching certificates that were awarded to white teachers. It was a long, hard struggle and never completely successful. Good Black teachers left the profession. Greer realized that school integration would not be beneficial for any child unless programs were held to set up in this transition. Thus, in 1971-72, with funds we got from a federal grant, we set up the Best Day of the Week program. This Saturday morning program concentrated on music, art, and athletics, subjects where Negro children excelled. It did not take long for white children, where am I? For white children to understand that Negro children were also smart and talented. In 1973, we wrote a grant to set up Homes and School. Hands program, where we brought parents into the schools to observe how to continue the teaching at home. This program brought books and learning games back into homes where none had ever existed. Through Greer, I met and became close friends with LaKay Banks, the wife of Dr. Cullen Banks. Our son Henry and Gary Banks were born at the same time in Alachua General Hospital, and those two babies spent a lot of time together as LaKay and I spent hours working on many civil rights projects. I remember the day I mentioned to Henry that Gary was Negro. Henry said, "No, he isn't. He has a swimming pool." During these tumultuous years, my husband, American historian Professor David Chalmers, received a Fulbright grant to teach at the University of Tokyo. Before leaving, LaKay and I enrolled our boys in Mrs. Williamson's nursery school to start in 1 year. When we returned, Henry had a great time at nursery school in Tokyo, and I was anxious for him to continue in one when we got back here, so I called right away to get him registered. Mrs. Williamson said that all her groups were now meeting at the Heritage Christian Church, and I should call them. I called right away and got Henry registered, and then called LaKay to tell her to get on the phone and right away register Gary. She did, and she called me back, telling me that they asked, "Are you Negro?" "Yes," said she, and was told that her son would not be accepted. It was a call to arms. We said we'd start our own damn nursery school. I wasn't going to say that. We were going to start our own damn nursery school, and we got to work. First stop was early childhood education at Norman Hall at the University of Florida, where Janet Larson and many of our friends were on faculty. They were excited that we were willing to take on the challenge and suggested that we go to the cooperative school route by copying the plans and curriculum of a cooperative school up in Maryland. We did just that. Our bylaws called for 20% of the children to be enrolled free, and that every family with a mother or a father who could take time off had to sign up as a teacher's aide once a week. For a short time, we had our school at the Quaker Meeting House near campus, where member Jean Beardsley was one of the teachers. But as the Vietnam War heated up and more young people became part of the pacifist congregation, there was no room at the Quaker Meeting House. So we then asked the Unitarian Universalist congregation if they would let us use their Sunday school rooms during the week. After long and delicate negotiations, they agreed to allow us to use the space rent-free. And the Millhopper Cooperative Nursery School opened on Northwest 43rd Street. Takachali Center, the state institution for the mentally disabled, was called Sunland Training Center then, had a huge workshop where their residents, along with some of our fathers, built all the furniture for the school. The fathers built the playground equipment and the sandbox. We were off and running. Henry Chalmers and Gary Banks were thrilled to learn that they could play at the same school 5 days a week. Gary's now a physician up in the Panhandle, and Henry's a lawyer in Atlanta. They stay in touch. We were all dedicated to having a completely integrated school. We got the rabbi's wife, Beverly Kobernitz, to serve on our board to make sure we were not all Christians. We got a teacher, I think Brenda Diaz's daughter, from the Baha'i faith, Sharon Dane, who was a Mormon, and many Jewish children were enrolled. With LaKay's help, we found some Negro children next door in the old free slave neighborhood of Rutledge. Our faculty advisors in the College of Education found some international faculty, students, and that agreed to join us. The reputation of the school soared. The art program was so respected that Lorna Rubin and a group of mothers organized a special Saturday morning art program. The Ken Block family, wanting their children to continue in this caring environment, founded Brentwood School, a private elementary school that still exists. As our waiting list grew and grew, we approached the Grace Presbyterian Church on Northwest 16th Street to ask if they would allow us to use their Sunday school rooms during the week, and they welcomed us. Now, we had to purchase supplies for this additional location and simply did not have enough money in the bank, so we had a fundraiser. At that time, Las Vegas had an event packet that they would mail to nonprofit organizations to help them raise money. We signed on, and when all the gambling equipment arrived, we had a grand casino fundraiser night at our home, and we raised enough money to save the program. Well, the good Presbyterian minister received lots of scolding from the congregation the next Sunday for allowing gambling to support a program at their church. We never told them that we also sold glasses of wine. During this time, I learned some measure of what it would be like to be a school principal. I spent countless hours on the telephone and attended meetings at least twice a week. I will never forget one such meeting at a parent's home. It was April the 4th, 1968, and someone came into the room to announce Martin Luther King had been shot and killed. The parents actually wanted to keep meeting. I went outside and threw up. The next morning, we women from Greer formally requested that the city close the streets around downtown Plaza so that people could congregate to grieve and seek solace. When the city refused, some of our members simply went and sat down in the middle of the street. Sue Legg and Pat Ferris were arrested, taken to jail, fined $200, and later released. Eventually, State Road 441, which runs through Gainesville and past the University of Florida, was named the Martin Luther King Highway. We shall never forget. LeKay's husband was the only Negro physician practicing in the county hospital, the county-owned hospital, Alachua General, and every service provided in that institution was strictly segregated. An absurd example of the system involved a fundraiser that the Pink Ladies organized to purchase new sterilizers for baby bottles. They had to raise enough funds to buy 2 sterilizers, one for white babies and one for black babies. Greer soon became involved in trying to get this separate and unequal treatment. They attended many county commissions and Alachua General Hospital boards of trustees to advocate for change. They were simply ignored. That was a mistake. Greer contacted the authorities in Washington, who were in charge of the Hill-Burton funds used by AGH to build their new updated building in 1959, and soon the federal investigation began. By then, Greer already had a sympathetic majority on the county commission, so the word went out to the hospital that everything must be integrated, and I was appointed to the board of trustees, along with Al Daniels, a politically active Negro in the community, to make sure that the integration went smoothly. It was a happy day when we saw the old Negro wing torn down, that old 26 building. Our civil rights movement was a marvelous training ground for organizing, assuming power, and confronting opposition. Many of us ran local and statewide political campaigns and played substantial roles in national elections. At least 3 of us served on the city commission. 2 members, and Jane Walker served on the county commission. I forgot about dear Jane. 2 members served as supervisor of election. Greer member Cynthia Chestnut also served on the county commission, the Florida State Legislature, was chair of the Florida Democratic Party, and is now back on the commission for the 2nd time. A true dedicated servant. Thank you so much. I've had fun reading this to you. And if there are any questions, I'll see if I've got answers.
Thank you, Jean. That was absolutely fascinating. And what impressed me was I came to Gainesville in 1976, and it's hard for me to believe that not very long before that, the kinds of things that you're describing were happening, and that it was necessary for good folks like you to jump in, join forces with others, and get things done. So we just can't be forgetting this past.
Right.
Where was the Negro Library? I do not remember it.
If you go down to Fifth Avenue and Second Street on the corner there, there's a green building called the Rosa B. Williams Recreation Center.
Uh,
That was the Negro Library.
That was
And-
the edge of my paper route because I was not allowed to deliver papers to the black residents, and the black paper boys were not allowed to deliver papers to the white residents. And it ran right together in Northwest, near Northwest there.
Sure. Yeah.
Phyllis, we have Paul Parker here on Zoom.
Yes, that was absolutely wonderful for me. I'm 91 years old, almost 92. So I wondered when you came to Gainesville, whether we were living in two different places in Florida at the same time. I was at Stetson working as an administrator between 1958 and 68.
Mhm.
So I'd be curious whether we were experiencing many of the same things which you have so beautifully put in your memoir and are sharing. I keep threatening to do my memoir, and I haven't gotten the courage up yet. But I was at Stetson when the year before integration occurred at the University of Florida. We took the first Black students in higher education, and had the repercussions of Sheriff McCall, who was very famous for a major article in the Saturday Evening Post about his activities, his anti-segregation and his Ku Klux Klan activities in the next county. So when we integrated and we took our first Black students, 3 of them, we had crosses burned in front of our administration building.
Mhm.
And when I went to work that day, my wife called not long after that to say people were threatening to kill us. And there were some other nasty things that went on. Everything was going along during that period with a group of Stetson people, faculty members, who were members of, as I was, the Human Relations Council, I think they called it, which was one of those groups that you obviously were active in here in Gainesville, 90 miles away.
Mhm.
And we had one or two little anecdotes which sort of shadow some of the things you were encountering here in Gainesville. Was that if you went to the barber shop, that's where you heard all of the most ugly comments as you would sit in a chair, wriggling and not daring to stand up and say anything. But it was the most ugly kind of racist conversations you could imagine as they were clipping your hair. And so when we demonstrated, when the troubles were going on in Selma, the members of the council, headed by a principal of the Black high school, who had the courage to stand up with us. And we were all standing in the center of town, demonstrating with placards and things around a fountain. And the newspaper was taking our picture. And one of my closest friends was a John Haig, who was head of American Studies. And he nudged me and he said, he was standing next to me, he said, "Paul, all of us from Stetson are tenured and you are not. You better keep that in mind." So that made me a little more nervous. But at the same time, I began to think when he said that, I'm never going to be able to get a haircut again. at a barber shop. So
Wow.
there were many of us around the state who were watching what was happening in Gainesville. And because it was such a hotbed of the kinds of activities that you had, we were well aware of that we had friends elsewhere. And there were some attempts at communications, I think, between our two groups.
Thank you,
But
Paul.
thank you again for reminding of
Thank you for sharing.
my past as well as yours.
J. Wayne Wright's was very good. We had a very good university president during those difficult years.
Yes, I
Gene,
knew him. I knew him well later in life when I worked for the Board of Regents.
Jean, I'm amazed with your story. We arrived in 1975. And of course, Kimberly and my Laura were friends. So you did so much. By the time we got here, the schools were integrated and the teachers were as well. So I had kids at middle school and elementary, and they experienced a integrated system. I was also concerned that I heard a short clip from Gainesville Sun that Harvey Ward's was vandalized today, and it's a racist issue. I was disturbed to hear that and sad to hear that.
Yeah, his mayoral office in City Hall. Somebody threw a rock through the window and included a hate mail note. So they're investigating. Any other comments, questions? I would just like to add that I grew up overseas in places like Sri Lanka, where I went to a local school with dark-skinned girls. I was the only American European person. When we were in Germany, I was in an integrated military dependent school. It never occurred to me that people would be segregated or discriminated against because of the color of their skin. When I came back to the States to go to college at George Washington in DC, I didn't know any Black students there. I was the strange kid out because I spoke with a slight accent and I had German cultural habits. It was pretty weird, but it was very strange to me that I would walk down the street and there would be a dark-skinned person walking towards me and she or he wouldn't look at me. There was this, and it's like, what's wrong? What's wrong here? So now things are so different. Thank God, thanks to people like Jean Chalmers and David Chalmers and all the other people that she's talked about.
I had a very simple question. The Presbyterian church that housed all the casino gambling equipment, was that Westminster Presbyterian?
Grace.
Oh, Grace.
Grace
yes.
Presbyterian, and
Yes.
and the gambling took place at our home.
Oh, I
Not-
know that.
Oh, yeah, not at the church.
Okay. Not on the premise.
My father was Scots Kirk, so I would know not to do it at
Right,
the Presbyterian church.
right. Do we have any more questions?
I'm a member of the United Church of Gainesville, and we had a Fifth Avenue's after-school program because students in the Fifth Avenue area did not have any after-school enrichment programs, and it was quite successful.
My college roommate at George Washington was very racist. And I didn't see any point in arguing with her, but I was really taken aback. And then I went to Greece to visit my parents over the summer of '63. They were assigned there at the time. And when I got back, apparently she'd been to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream like speech, completely changed. Now she's, I don't know where she is, but now she's, at that time, at least, she made a big change.
Just another anecdote of growing up here. My father had a gas station on Northwest Fifth Avenue and 13th Street. And one of our customers was A. Quinn Jones. And so when he came in, I checked his tires, I checked the water and the oil, pumped his gas. And some of our customers would have a charge account. I don't think he did, but I asked Daddy if he wants to write a check, how much can I give him for the check? He said, whatever's in the cash drawer, because he was a good guy.
Phyllis,
Anything else? Okay, Richard?
and then we have one on Zoom after this.
Well, thank you all. And thank you, Gene. This has been absolutely wonderful. And next Wednesday, we're going to hear from Gwendolyn Zohara Simmons, who many of you know. Zohara was a undergraduate at Spelman College in Atlanta when, much to the horror of her family, she agreed to go to Mississippi with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that began her lifetime of work in civil rights. And I think you'll find her also next week to be a fascinating time with a wonderful person, just like we had now with Jean. So again, thank
Her book? Oh,
my,
I've read it, but I don't remember.
yes, my memory slips.
Yeah, well, you should just Google her name and
Right.
read that book. It's
Right.
fascinating. Yeah, she
Oh.
worked with the Quakers.
Again, thank you so much for a wonderful afternoon.
We have one more quick question. Pat Harden, go ahead.
And what a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I just want, someone mentioned Sheriff Willis McCall. And if you want to read a book, which is, I warn you, very difficult to read, it's called Devil in the Grove. And it's about Willis McCall. I'm sure you've read it, Jean. And it will give you the very worst of segregation. And where Thurgood Marshall rather got to start. So, and thank you again.
He was our neighbor
Oh, good grief.
in the next county.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
when
All
we
the
moved
time.
to, when we
Roaming
moved to
around.
Orange County, he was still sheriff.
Yeah, he was